This is what happens to weeds." The voice was sharp, filled with a venom that cut through the pleasant afternoon air. He'd just thrown the entire root ball, heavy with dark, wet soil, directly at my chest. The man, the new president of our homeowners association, stood there fuming in front of all our neighbors. The mud dripped down my simple beige shirt, a cold, ugly stain. "Now get out," he spat, his face twisted with rage. "You and your trashy flowers are no longer welcome here." He thought he had all the power in our exclusive community, but he had no idea that the muddy land he just desecrated was mine. He would learn his lesson very, very soon. It all started with the roses. For me, they weren't just flowers. They were a living history, a connection to my late husband, Robert. We had moved to Bel Air, Los Angeles, decades ago, when these hills were quieter and the houses felt more like homes than fortresses. We planted that garden together, right on the edge of the communal green space we had donated to the community ourselves. Each bush had a story. The pale yellow ones were for our anniversary. The deep reds, his favorite, were planted the year our son graduated from Stanford. But the most special was the Vance Crimson, a unique hybrid Robert cultivated himself. Its petals were the color of rich velvet, and it had won awards. More importantly, it was the last thing he gave me before he passed. I tended to that garden every day. At 72, my hands were stained with soil. My knees often ached, but it was a labor of love. I wore simple linen trousers and old comfortable shirts. I didn't need anything else. The feel of the earth was more satisfying to me than any fancy boutique on Rodeo Drive. Then Markham Finch moved in 2 years ago. He bought the massive glass and steel mansion overlooking the green space.
He was a man in his mid-40s, with leathery, tanned skin from too many hours on the golf course, and sandy blonde hair that was meticulously styled to hide its retreat. He always wore crisp polo shirts and carried himself with an air of frantic importance. From the beginning, he saw me not as a neighbor, but as an eyesore. He'd stride past the garden, his thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. He couldn't understand why someone in Bel Air would be on their hands and knees in the dirt. In his world, you paid people for that. He clearly mistook my passion for poverty. His first move after being elected HOA president was to beautify the community. That meant sterile, uniform landscaping. My vibrant, slightly wild rose garden didn't fit his vision. He approached me one Tuesday morning while I was pruning the Vance Crimson. "Eleanor, dear," he began, the word dear sounding like an insult coming from him. "We're implementing new aesthetic guidelines for the common areas. This chaotic patch will have to go." I looked up at him, my trowel in hand. His deep-set eyes were cold, assessing. On his wrist, a gold Rolex glittered in the California sun, a stark contrast to the dirt under my own fingernails. I saw the judgment in his gaze, the easy dismissal of a man who equated worth with wealth. "Mr. Finch," I said calmly, "this garden has been here for over 30 years. It's part of the community's history." "History doesn't align with progress," he retorted, a smug smile playing on his lips. "We need a clean, modern look, something that reflects the property values here. Your hobby is dragging us down." He saw an old woman in dirty clothes. He didn't see the woman who had signed the original land grants for half the properties on this hill. He didn't see the woman whose family name was on the library and the local hospital wing. He saw what he wanted to see, someone insignificant, someone he could bully. I simply nodded and went back to my pruning. My silence seemed to infuriate him more than any argument could have. He wanted a fight, a capitulation. I gave him neither. A week later, a formal violation notice was taped to my front door, citing a rule he himself had pushed through the board last month. My chauffeur and longtime friend, Arthur, saw it when he arrived to take me to a charity luncheon. Arthur had been with my family since before Robert passed. He was a tall, dignified African-American man with a calm presence that always soothed me. He wore his impeccable black uniform, a symbol of a professionalism Markham could never understand. "Another one, Mrs. Vance?" he asked,
his voice low as he gently peeled the notice from the heavy oak door of my home. "It seems Mr. Finch is very passionate about landscaping," I replied with a sigh, placing the letter on the marble entryway table next to a vase of my roses. "Passionate about power, you mean," Arthur corrected gently. "He sees your garden, but he doesn't see you. He drives that new Porsche Carrera around like he owns the place, when in fact—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Patience, Arthur," I said. "Men like Mr. Finch often create their own downfall. We just have to let them have enough rope." I didn't want to fight him on his level. My husband always said you should never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. But Markham wasn't patient. My refusal to engage with his petty rules was a direct affront to his ego. He needed to prove his authority, and I was his chosen target. The stage for his grand performance was the annual Bel Air Community Summer Gathering, held on the very green space my garden bordered. Residents mingled on the perfectly manicured lawn, sipping champagne and making polite conversation. I, as usual, was in my garden, finding more peace with my roses than with the small talk. I was wearing my usual gardening attire, feeling the sun on my back when his shadow fell over me. "I thought I made myself clear." Markham's voice was low and menacing. Several of our neighbors, holding their delicate glasses, turned to look. "Good afternoon, Mr. Finch," I said, not looking up from a particularly stubborn weed. "I gave you a formal notice. This garden was to be removed by today." His voice was louder now, drawing more attention. He wanted an audience. He wanted to make an example of me. I finally stood up, wiping my hands on my trousers, and faced him. "And I have chosen to ignore it," I said, my voice even. "This garden is not in violation of any legitimate community bylaw." A flicker of disbelief, then pure rage crossed his face. How dare this old, poor woman defy him, in front of everyone, in front of the people he so desperately wanted to impress, the people who drove Bentleys and had last names that were on buildings? He couldn't stand it. "You don't get to choose," he snarled, taking a step closer. The air crackled with tension. Our neighbors froze, conversations dying on their lips. They were watching a train wreck in slow motion. "This is my final warning," he said through gritted teeth. "Get rid of it, now." I simply looked at him, at the desperation for control in his eyes. I saw a small, insecure man drowning in a world he thought he could conquer with money and aggression. I felt a wave of pity for him, and that must have shown on my face. For him, my pity was the ultimate insult. That's when he snapped. With a guttural roar of frustration, he lunged past me. Not at me, but at the Vance Primson. He grabbed the main stalk of my husband's prized rosebush with both hands and pulled. The sound of thick roots tearing from the earth was a violent, sickening rip. He held the entire bush aloft for a moment, its beautiful crimson flowers now hanging limply, its roots exposed and dripping soil. The crowd gasped. It was an act of such pointless destruction, of such naked cruelty, that it stunned everyone into silence. And then he turned to me, his face a mask of triumph and fury. "This is what happens to weeds," he yelled, and heaved the entire muddy root ball at me. It hit me square in the chest. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I didn't stumble. I just stood there as clods of dirt fell to the ground around my feet, leaving a huge, wet brown smear across my chest. The smell of fresh earth, a scent I usually loved, now felt like a violation. "Now get out," he commanded, his chest heaving. "You and your trashy flowers are no longer welcome here." I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I didn't even wipe away the mud. I just held his gaze, letting the silence stretch. I let him see my disappointment. I let all our neighbors see his pathetic, ugly display of power. In that moment, he hadn't dirtied me. He had exposed the filth within himself for all to see. Slowly, deliberately, I turned my back on him and began to walk away from my ruined garden, leaving him standing there amidst the silent judgment of our neighbors. I walked toward the street, my heart aching for my husband's roses. That's when a low, powerful engine purred to life. A sleek, black Maserati Quattroporte pulled up to the curb, its paint gleaming like polished obsidian. Arthur stepped out, his expression unreadable,
but his eyes filled with a cold fire as he took in my soiled shirt. He opened the rear passenger door for me with a crisp, practiced motion. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice clear and formal, loud enough for everyone on the lawn to hear. As I moved to get in, he handed me a leather portfolio I had asked him to bring from the car.
"Your documents for the community trust meeting," he said. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a deep, sorrowful anger. The portfolio slipped from my grasp, falling open on the pavement. A single important document slid out, landing face up at my feet. It was the original land deed for the entire Bel Air development tract. My father's name was on it, and below it, mine. And at the bottom, highlighted in the assessor's notes, was the last appraised value, $78 million. Markham, who had started to swagger toward me, perhaps to deliver one final insult, froze. His eyes locked onto the document on the ground. I saw his face drain of all color. The numbers, the names, the legal seal, the reality crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He looked from the deed on the ground to me, the old woman in the mud-stained shirt. He looked at the Maserati, at the liveried chauffeur calling me Mrs. Vance. And in that horrifying, silent moment, Markham Finch finally understood. I wasn't just a resident in his community. I was the owner, and he had just declared war on his landlady in the most public way imaginable. The world seemed to hold its breath. The light chatter of the garden party had evaporated, leaving behind a thick, heavy silence. Every eye in Bel Air was on the piece of paper lying on the pristine asphalt, its legal text a stark condemnation of Markham Finch's entire world. His face, usually tanned and confident, had turned a pasty, sickly gray. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. He stared at the deed, then at me, then back at the deed. The name Vance on the document seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was the same name on the street signs, the same name on the plaque at the community entrance. It was a name he had seen every day, but never connected to the quiet old woman in the garden. He saw gardener. The paper screamed landowner. Arthur, ever the professional, broke the spell. Without a word, he bent down with a smooth, fluid motion. He picked up the deed, his gloved fingers treating it with the reverence it deserved. He gently brushed off a speck of dust before placing it back inside the leather portfolio. He did it all without once looking at Markham. It was the most profound dismissal I had ever witnessed. He held the portfolio for me as I slid into the cool, cream-colored leather of the Maserati's back seat. The door closed with a soft, expensive thud, sealing me off from the scene. Through the tinted window, I saw the neighbors. They were frozen statues, their champagne flutes held awkwardly. Mrs. Davenport, who had always praised Markham's aggressive new policies, now looked horrified. Her Hermès scarf seemed to be strangling her. Markham finally moved. He took a clumsy, stumbling step forward, his hand outstretched as if to stop us. His face was a mess of confusion and terror. "Wait," he croaked, the single word thin and pathetic. "Mrs. Vance, I didn't." But Arthur was already in the driver's seat. The engine hummed to life, a low growl of power that Markham flinched. We pulled away from the curb smoothly, leaving him standing there, a pathetic monument to his own arrogance, surrounded by the silent, judging eyes of the community he so desperately wanted to lead. As we drove the short distance to my house, the silence inside the car was as heavy as the one we had left behind. I looked down at my shirt. The dark, wet mud was already starting to dry, cracking and flaking onto the pristine leather seat. It felt obscene, a violation of the quiet, orderly world I had so carefully maintained since Robert's death. "He destroyed Robert's rose," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was just a statement of fact, a wound given voice.
"Yes, ma'am," Arthur said, his eyes on the road but his attention entirely on me. "He did." "All these years, Arthur," I continued, thinking aloud, "we've lived here. We've tried to be quiet neighbors. We never used our name like a weapon. Robert believed that true influence was silent. He said it was the people who shouted the loudest who had the least to say." "Mr. Vance was a wise man," Arthur replied. "Mr. Finch is not." We turned into my private driveway, passing through gates that Markham had probably assumed were just for an ordinary, if large, home. The driveway wound through an acre of ancient oak trees before opening up to reveal my house, a sprawling, classic Spanish-style mansion that was hidden from the main road. It was the original estate house, the one from which all the other lots had been sold off by my father decades ago. Arthur parked the car under the portico and came around to open my door. He didn't offer a hand, knowing I preferred to manage on my own, but he stood by, a silent, supportive presence. Inside, the house was cool and quiet. The entryway was vast, with a marble floor and a sweeping staircase. A portrait of my late husband, painted years ago, hung above the fireplace in the main hall. He looked out from the canvas with a kind, intelligent gaze. I walked over to it, my muddy shoes silent on the thick Persian rug. "What would you do, Robert?" I whispered to the painting. "You always knew how to handle men like him. You would have disarmed him with a clever joke or a quiet word." But I was not Robert. The humiliation I felt was cold and sharp. It wasn't just about the mud or the destroyed rose. It was about the calculated cruelty of it. He had targeted me because he thought I was weak, poor, and insignificant. He had tried to erase a piece of my husband's legacy because it was an inconvenience to his sterile, modern vision. Arthur appeared at my elbow with a glass of water. "Will you be calling your lawyers, Mrs. Vance?" he asked gently. I took a sip, the cool water doing little to calm the storm inside me. "Evicting him would be the easy answer," I said, more to myself than to Arthur. "One phone call and he would be out by the end of the month. His residency here is conditional, based on the original bylaws. He broke the code of conduct in the most public way possible." "Indeed," Arthur said, his tone neutral. But I knew him. I knew he was hoping I would bring the hammer down. But my mind was racing. Ruining Markham Finch would be simple. A word to some old friends on the board of his investment firm. A quiet call to the bank that held the mortgage on his glass house. His life in Bel Air would be over. He would be a pariah. Was that what I wanted? The thought of such complete destruction left a sour taste in my mouth. It felt too much like him, using overwhelming power to crush someone smaller. No, that wasn't Robert's way, and it wouldn't be mine. Justice and revenge were two very different things. "He needs to understand," I said finally. "He doesn't just need to be punished, Arthur. He needs to comprehend the depth of his mistake. He needs to see that dignity isn't measured by the price of your watch or the size of your house." I walked from the hall into Robert's old study. It was my favorite room in the house, paneled in dark wood and lined with thousands of books. His scent still lingered in the air, a faint mix of old paper and leather. I sat down in his large armchair behind the massive oak desk. On the desk was a silver frame holding a picture of me and Robert, taken in the rose garden years ago. We were laughing, and I was holding a perfect Vance crimson bloom. The pain was a fresh stab in my heart.
He hadn't just thrown mud at me, he had thrown it on this memory. My decision solidified. It would not be a quiet, behind-the-scenes financial execution. It would be a lesson delivered with the same public audience he had chosen for my humiliation. He wanted to wield the power of the HOA, then I would use the very foundation of this community to dismantle him. I looked at the portfolio Arthur had placed on the desk. The $78 million deed was just a piece of paper. The real power was in the trust my father had established, the legal framework that governed every blade of grass and every brick laid in this community. A framework Markham Finch had never bothered to truly understand. "Arthur," I said, my voice now firm, all traces of doubt gone. "Please get Michael on the line for me. Michael Sterling, my attorney." "Right away, Mrs. Vance," he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. He knew that tone. It was the tone I used when a decision had been made, a course of action set in stone. He stepped out to make the call. I sat there for a moment, looking at Robert's portrait. I wasn't going to be silent anymore. My quiet life had been a choice, a preference, but he had mistaken my quiet for weakness. He had mistaken my love for my garden as a sign of poverty. Now he was going to learn who Eleanor Vance really was, and he was going to do it in front of everyone he had tried so hard to impress. The lesson would be painful, it would be public, and it would be permanent. Arthur came back into the room a moment later. Mr. Sterling is on line 1. I picked up the heavy receiver of the old rotary phone on the desk. Michael, I said, my voice clear and steady. It's Eleanor Vance. I need you to call an emergency meeting of the Bel Air Community Trust, and I want you to personally draft a notice of censure for the HOA president, Mr.
Markham Finch? Yes, for immediate review. On the other end of the line, Michael Sterling's voice was as crisp and precise as I remembered. He had been my family's attorney for 40 years, first as a junior partner under his father, and now as the head of a firm that managed the assets of half of Los Angeles's old money. He didn't gasp or express shock. He simply listened. An emergency meeting of the Community Trust, I repeated, my voice gaining strength. Not the HOA board, Michael, the trust. I want every single homeowner to receive a personal invitation. The meeting will be held tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock in the main hall of the clubhouse. There was a brief pause. I could hear the faint scratch of his fountain pen on paper. And the agenda? He asked, his tone all business. A formal review of the conduct of the acting HOA president, Mr. Markham Finch, I stated. Specifically, the destruction of private property on common grounds and behavior unbecoming a community representative. I want you to draft a notice of censure. Have it ready for the meeting. A censure is a strong step, Eleanor, Michael said, a hint of caution in his voice. It's a permanent mark on his record here. His actions were a permanent mark on my husband's memory. I replied, my voice dropping slightly. This is not about revenge, Michael. This is about principle. The bylaws my father wrote for this community were about mutual respect. Mr. Finch has mistaken them for a rule book to bully people he deems beneath him. He needs to be reminded of the foundation upon which his very house is built. I could almost hear him nod on the other end of the line. I understand completely. The notices will go out within the hour. I will be there personally with the drafted censure motion. Is there anything else? Yes, I said, looking at the mud still caked on my gardening shoes. Ensure the notice states that attendance is strongly encouraged for all residents.
I want the entire community to witness this. Consider it done, Eleanor, he said, and the line went dead. I placed the receiver back in its cradle. The click echoed in the quiet study. A sense of finality settled over me. The gears were now in motion. There was no turning back. Arthur stood in the doorway, his posture unchanged, but I could see the deep satisfaction in his eyes. The first stone has been cast, he said quietly. It was he who cast it, Arthur, I corrected him. I am simply making sure it lands where it belongs. I stood up and walked out of the study, feeling the weight of the day in my bones. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache. In the grand entryway, I caught my reflection in the large, gilt-edged mirror. I saw an old woman with white hair, her face etched with grief and new resolve, with a ridiculous, ugly smear of mud across her chest. For a moment, I saw what Markham Finch must have seen, someone frail, someone easily dismissed. But then I met my own eyes in the mirror, and I saw the steel that he had missed, the same steel that had allowed my father to turn these empty hills into a thriving community, the same steel that had helped me navigate the world of finance and philanthropy after Robert died. I need a hot bath, I said, turning away from the reflection. And Arthur, please have my navy Chanel suit prepared for tomorrow evening. An excellent choice, Mrs. Vance, he said with a slight bow. It projects authority. It projects clarity, I said, and that is what tomorrow will be about. As I soaked in the tub, the steam rising around me, the phone began to ring. It rang once, and Arthur's voice, muffled by the thick bathroom door, answered it. A few minutes later, it rang again, and again. The news was spreading through Bel Air like a wildfire. The gossip network, usually fueled by whispers about who was getting a new swimming pool or whose son was rejected from Harvard, had a new, explosive topic. When I emerged later, wrapped in a thick towel, Arthur was waiting with a cup of chamomile tea. The phone has been active, he said, his expression carefully neutral. Let me guess, I said, taking the cup. Mrs. Davenport was first, full of apologies and outrage on my behalf. Arthur's lips twitched. Her husband, Mr. Davenport, called as well. He wanted to personally assure you that he never supported Mr. Finch's overzealous policies. He mentioned his new Bentley is having engine trouble for the third time this month. I sighed. The pathetic, transparent maneuvering of people trying to align themselves with power. They hadn't cared when an old gardener was being humiliated, but now that the old gardener was revealed to be the millionaire landowner who held the deed to their precious real estate, they were falling over themselves to offer support. Their loyalty was as shallow as their manicured lawns. "And Mr. Finch?" I asked. "He has called 6 times," Arthur reported. "He sounds distressed. He also tried to call Mr. Sterling's office, but was informed that Mr. Sterling was unavailable to him." Good. Let him sweat. Let him spend the night contemplating the sheer scale of his miscalculation. Let him sit in his cold glass mansion, the one he bought for millions of dollars, and realize he was nothing more than a tenant who had just assaulted his landlady. I didn't eat much for dinner. My appetite was gone. Instead, I spent the evening in my library, surrounded by the comforting presence of books. I pulled down an old photo album, its leather cover worn smooth with time. I flipped through the pages, seeing pictures of Robert and me when we were young, planning the garden. There was one of him, smiling, holding up a single perfect Vance crimson bloom. A wave of anger, sharp and hot, washed over me again. This wasn't just about a community bylaw. This was a desecration. Markham Finch, in his blind arrogance, had trampled on something sacred. My resolve hardened. My plan was not cruel, it was necessary. It was a lesson in humility, a concept entirely foreign to him. Later that night, unable to sleep, I walked out onto the large stone terrace that overlooked the community. The lights of the mansions twinkled below like a blanket of scattered diamonds. From here, I could see the sterile, perfect roof of Markham's house. I imagined him in there, pacing, frantic, his world shrinking with every passing minute. I felt a pang of something that was almost pity. He had built his identity on a foundation of perceived power and status symbols, his Rolex, his Porsche Carrera, his title as HOA president. And with one clumsy, arrogant act, he had set a fire to the whole flimsy structure. What would be left of him when it all burned away? My gaze drifted to the community garden. Under the soft glow of the landscape lighting, I saw a figure moving. It was Arthur. He had taken a shovel and a bucket and was carefully, gently cleaning the area around the uprooted rosebush. He gathered the scattered clods of earth, and then, with the tenderness of a surgeon, he replanted the bush in its rightful place, tamping the soil around its wounded roots. I watched him for a long time, my heart swelling with gratitude for his quiet, unwavering loyalty. He hadn't just been my husband's chauffeur. He was family. He understood, without needing to be told, that restoring the rose was as important as punishing the man who had torn it out. The bush looked broken and sad, its crimson flowers bruised, but it was back in the earth. It had a chance to survive. And that, I realized, was what this was all about. It wasn't about destruction. It was about restoration. Restoring the dignity of my husband's memory. Restoring the principle of respect in our community. And giving a broken man a chance to see the ugliness of his own actions. I went back and sighed, a profound sense of calm settling over me. I knew what I had to do, and I knew how to do it. The anger had cooled into a focused, unshakable purpose. Markham Finch wanted to make a public statement about power. Tomorrow, I would give him one. The next evening, the clubhouse buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. The main hall, usually reserved for charity galas and holiday parties, was filled to capacity. The air was thick with expensive perfume and nervous tension. Every homeowner in Bel Air was there, drawn by the irresistible gravity of scandal. They stood in small, whispering groups, their eyes darting towards the door, then towards the empty chair at the head of the long oak table reserved for the HOA president. Arthur drove me to the front entrance in the Maserati. He didn't park in the lot with a sea of BMWs and Mercedes. He pulled right up to the curb. When he opened my door, a hush fell over the residents gathered on the steps. I emerged not as the quiet gardener, but as Eleanor Vance. My navy Chanel suit was immaculate, its clean, classic lines a stark contrast to the mud-stained clothes of the day before. My white hair was styled in its usual simple bun, and I wore the pearl necklace Robert had given me on our 30th anniversary. I walked through the parted crowd, my steps measured and calm. I didn't look at anyone, but I could feel their stares. They weren't just looking at me, they were re-evaluating every simple hello I had ever given them, every time they had seen me kneeling in the dirt. Michael Sterling, my attorney, stood to greet me. He gave a slight, respectful nod and gestured for me to take a seat at the center of the head table. Moments later, Markham Finch arrived. He looked terrible. His usually perfect sandy hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His expensive suit seemed to hang off him as if he had shrunk overnight. He walked into the room with a forced, jerky confidence that collapsed the moment he saw me sitting there. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and brittle. He hesitated, then shuffled awkwardly to his designated chair at the end of the table, as far away from me as possible. He avoided my gaze, his eyes fixed on the polished wood in front of him. The room fell completely silent. Michael Sterling tapped his pen on a glass, the sound sharp and clear. "This emergency meeting of the Bel Air Community Trust is now in session," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "The sole item on the agenda is a review of the conduct of the Homeowners Association president, Mr. Markham Finch." Michael laid out the facts clinically and without emotion. He described the incident, citing the specific community bylaws regarding the sanctity of common areas and the code of conduct for elected representatives. He spoke of the destruction of property and the public harassment of a fellow resident. He never once mentioned my ownership of the land. He didn't need to. The deed from yesterday had done its work. Everyone in this room knew. When he finished, he turned to Markham. "Mr. Finch, do you have anything to say in response to these observations?" Markham swallowed hard. He looked around the room, at the faces of the neighbors he had tried so desperately to impress. He saw no support there, only cold, curious judgment. His eyes finally, reluctantly, landed on me. "It was a misunderstanding," he began, his voice raspy. I was under a lot of stress. The aesthetic guidelines, I was just trying to uphold the standards of the community." He sounded like a child making excuses. "The standards of the community?" I spoke for the first time, my voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. Every head swiveled towards me. "Mr. Finch, let's be clear about what those standards are. My father founded this community on one principle, that it would be a place of peace and mutual respect, a refuge from the noise of the city. He believed a person's character was their true asset, not the balance in their bank account." I paused, letting my words sink in. "You saw me tending my garden, and you saw a problem. You saw dirt under my fingernails and assumed I was poor. You saw quietness and assumed I was weak. You didn't see a neighbor. You saw an obstacle to your vision of what this place should be, a sterile showcase for wealth, devoid of any personal history or character." I looked directly at him, and for the first time he was forced to meet my gaze. "That rosebush you ripped from the ground was a hybrid my late husband spent 10 years cultivating. It was the last gift he ever gave me. You didn't just destroy a plant, Mr. Finch. You took a piece of my history, a piece of my heart, and you threw it in the mud to make a point about your own temporary authority." A wave of shame so profound it was almost visible washed over him. His face crumpled. I didn't know," he whispered, the words barely audible. "And that is the entire problem," I said, my voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with a sad finality. "You didn't know because you never bothered to ask. You never saw the person, only the problem you wanted to solve. You wielded your power like a club, and you were so blinded by it that you couldn't see what you were destroying." Michael Sterling cleared his throat. "The trust has before it a motion of censure," he announced, holding up a document. A vote to permanently strip Mr. Finch of his title as HOA president and to formally condemn his actions. But before he could call for a vote, I held up my hand. That will not be necessary, Michael. A murmur went through the crowd. Michael looked at me, confused.
Markham stared, his eyes wide with disbelief. A censure is a legal document, I continued, addressing the room. It's paper and ink. It won't teach the lesson that needs to be learned here. Mr. Finch's punishment shouldn't be a mark on a piece of paper and a file. It should be an act of restoration. I turned my full attention back to Markham. You will not be censured, Mr. Finch. You will not be evicted. You will, however, resign as president of the HOA, effective immediately. He nodded quickly, eagerly. Yes, of course. Anything. That's the easy part, I said, my voice hardening again. For the next 6 months, you will be responsible for the community garden. You will report to me every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. You will learn to properly care for every single rose bush. You will learn their names, their histories. You will learn how to prune them, how to feed them, how to protect them from disease. You will get dirt under your own fingernails, and you will personally tend to the Vance crimson until it is healthy and blooming again. The room was utterly silent. This was a judgment no one had expected. It was more intimate, more personal, and in many ways more devastating than any legal or financial penalty. It wasn't about ruining him. It was about remaking him. You will learn the difference between value and price, I concluded. You will learn that respect is something you earn through your actions, not something you demand with your title. This is not a request. It is a condition of your continued residency in this community. My community. Markham Finch sat there, utterly broken. The powerful HOA president was gone. In his place was just a man, stripped of all his pretenses, facing a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Tears welled in his eyes, not of self-pity, but of what looked like genuine, gut-wrenching shame. He slowly rose to his feet. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at me.
I accept, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And, Mrs. Vance, I am truly sorry. It was the first genuine thing I had ever heard him say. I simply gave him a single, slow nod. The meeting was over. Michael Sterling adjourned it, and the residents began to file out, not with the excited chatter of gossip, but with a quiet, contemplative air. They had come for a public execution. Instead, they had witnessed an act of profound, and perhaps even merciful, justice. Arthur was waiting for me as I walked out. He opened the door to the Maserati, and I got in, the weight of the last 2 days finally settling on me. As we pulled away, I looked back at the clubhouse. Markham Finch was still standing on the steps, alone, watching us leave. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He had made a terrible mistake, one born of arrogance and insecurity. I could have destroyed him, taken his home, his reputation, everything he had built. But what would that have accomplished? It would have only proven that I was capable of the same kind of cruelty he was. Instead, I chose to give him a chance to learn, to grow, to maybe, just maybe, become a better man. Robert would have approved. The garden would be tended to, and a lesson in humility would be learned. That felt like a victory more satisfying than any revenge. And you, what would you have done? Would you have chosen forgiveness? Or would you have made him pay a different price?